This is the empirical sequel to the paper presented in Jerusalem at this conference last year. As Menahem was saying, people are very familiar with VIX. They use it to assess what is going on in the volatility market. What people do not usually realize is that value at risk and conditional value at risk can be read directly without any computation really from the option market. So last year I presented that in Jerusalem. Today I will apply it to the Standard & Poor index and compare results with the filter historical simulation, which of course is also something I developed, but is already fairly well established. So why do I want to do that? Because when we do statistical risk measure, we always have to impose some regularity conditions. Thank you. So basically, we try to extrapolate from past observations, but in the markets, occasionally, especially when there are crashes or big events like US elections, there are more informations which may be used by investors to set option prices, but they're not obviously in the past record. So GACH generally, which is also the basis for filter historical simulation, measures risk well at short horizons. But basically the GACH forecast past few days become not very informative. They revert to long-term mean. That's the reason we introduce filter historical simulation. So what I want to do in this paper is to have a good assessment of risk for 1 month. And the reason is that I'm also a portfolio manager. I have several mutual funds. And if you have to adjust the risk of a large fund, it's probably something you don't want to do it in the last 10 minutes. So basically, VIX skew are very popular, while for value at risk and conditional value at risk, typically people use only the statistical approach. We're going to show that that is not necessary, and of course, what we need are several things. First, that some sort of pricing density exists and that the options be liquid for the horizon we're interested in, and also that there'll be no big liquidity premium, although it's possible to adjust for them if you know more or less the shape. And to keep things simple, allow me to start defining value at risk and conditional value at risk under the pricing distribution, the one of the option market. Then we'll discuss changes in measures. What is the biggest advantage of this method is that it overcomes the difficulties in the estimation of conditional value at risk. You may have read that is not elicitable, at least by itself. And anyway, it's always problematic to try to get enough observations in the far tail to have a good expected value. The option market provides that accurately. Of course, if there is some sort of behavioral bias, the option will reflect the same bias, but it's certainly a very useful complementary view, and we'll see that it saves you lots of trouble most of the time and brings you exactly where the filter historical simulation will bring you. So under the pricing measure, how do you define? Well, basically the value at risk is a percentile of the distribution. So it's the difference between the current market value and the strike price of an option. The strike price of this option is defined by equation 4, which is essentially the derivative of equation 3. So basically, if you do not want to attach yourself to Black-Scholes or other models, although of course you can also do that most of the time without much error. What you do is to look at the slope of the put price relative to the strike price. If you want value at 5%, value at risk at 5%, you want the point at which that slope is 5%. You can do it numerically very easily if you have many options. Of course, if you apply Black-Scholes, you'll be talking of what we call the cumulative normal or minus d sub 2. But, that's something we can use to check robustness, but of course we do not have to rely on it. And we'll see that the results are very similar. So the value at risk is essentially identified by the slope of the empirical put pricing function as a function of the strike price. The conditional value at risk is the sum of the value at risk we just defined plus the expected value on the tail, which under the pricing distribution is essentially the put price divided by the alpha level because it's conditional. So you assume you are in the tail where you'll be really only 5% of the time. So in such a case you multiply the put times 20, the inverse of 5%. And also you have to consider, although it's very minor for horizons of interest, that the put is discounted, so if you want the expected value, you compound at the risk-free rate. So this is essentially the equation that you have to use to read directly the conditional value at risk from option prices. Of course, if you like to look at short positions, you have to look at the right tail rather than the left tail, so you take a call and do exactly the same thing. So we want to make sure that there is enough liquidity. That's the reason for which I will not present results at 1%, but I can do it at 5 or 10% without much trouble. Of course, you may object that I've done all of that under the pricing measure, while risk managers usually are interested in the objective or historical probability or physical probability measure. So you may change measure if you have a model in mind, but that is really not necessary for risk assessment. So, of course, I spare you everything about the changing measure, the theory of Gishanov theorem, if you assume that there is some diffusion, or Radon-Nikodym theorem in a more general case. But anyway, this is really not interesting from our perspective, and the reason for that is that if you think of the state price, which is behind the Arrow-Debré model from which we start, that is the present value of the probability. Well, you have to consider a simple state contingent claim. So the expected value of the state contingent claim is the second expression, S is the state price, and it's equal to the pricing probability discounted at the risk-free rate. We always teach our students that. And of course, that's also equal to the physical probability discounted at the risk-adjusted discount rate. So R is the risk-free rate, capital R is the risk-adjusted rate. Now, if the risk premium, the annualized risk premium stay finite, when capital T goes to 0, the two things converge. So that basically is something that we showed for several models in our previous paper. If you like to persuade yourself, take the model you want and try to figure what is the risk premium attached to an option over 10 days or a month. I do not recommend that you do it for 1 year horizon, of course. Then you better change measure. So basically, this was what I was presenting last year, and it's my theoretical paper. What I'm going to talk about this year that it is new is how the risk of the Standard & Poor index evolved according to this method and how that compares with the filtered historical simulation. So basically, results are very similar. We have done this exercise at 1 month horizon this far. Today, Carlo was telling me that he just did it also for 1 week options, which have been introduced more recently. So for monthly options, which is what we used in the results I'm going to show you, we have liquidity essentially for the last 10 years. So we used about 130 months, so 130 non-overlapping observations. And basically, we found that the exceedances of value at risk are about 2/3 of the expected number at the confidence levels we chose for 1 month, which were 5, 10, and 15%. And almost exactly the same result we get doing a filter historical simulation for all these dates. So results are very similar. If you really want to look at the difference, there is a bit of clustering during the financial crisis, 2008-2009, and basically over 2 years we get 3 exceedances. We should get a little more than 1 on average, but of course there is a bit of statistical variation. While under filter historical simulation we get 4 exceedances, but you know, it's marginally worse to compute value at risk under the physical measure, but I will not really attach much weight to it because anyway we're talking a very small number of exceedances, and so we expect some statistical fluctuation. So the main problem with these results is that we wanted to do it over a long time, so we had to use monthly horizons to have non-overlapping horizons. And as I was saying earlier, now there are also weekly and 3-day options, so we can have not overlapping observations much more frequently, but for a much shorter number of years. Basically, we will not be able to go back to the crisis of 2008 because those options with shorter maturities didn't exist in those days. Okay, given that, as I told you, the value at risk, no matter how measured, seem to be a bit understated in our sample, at least relative to the expected average. Of course, you never get the expected average in a small sample, but in our case, we were a bit below. I decided that to give more power to the test of the conditional value at risk, I will look just at the exceedance, so the adjusted option price. So I cancel away the understatement of the value at risk, which is in our sample. And basically, I find these values for the left tail and for the right tail, which is done, as I said, with calls to represent the risk of short positions. And we find that the model 3 consistently reports uh, an average expected exceedance which is above Black-Scholes. If you look at the realized exceedances, of course we're talking of very small numbers, because we said they were about 2/3, so at 10% we have about, we expect 12 exceedances, we got about 8. But if you look at the average of realized exceedances, which is the right half of this table, you find that more or less they seem to be in line with the forecasts of either model. About the filter historical simulation estimates, there is no statistical test by itself. It's not elicitable, as has been shown in JASA and in other publications. So what we do is the closest thing to a test, which is Acerebi's Z statistics, which, if you're not familiar with it, will be correct if you got the correct value at risk model, and then you look at the exceedances over the correct value at risk. So it's conditionally correct, let's say. And it's not a very powerful test, unfortunately. If you compute the confidence interval, especially with the small sample sizes, you find that it is not surprising that the null hypothesis of a correct conditional value at risk is accepted. So what are my conclusions? Basically, I showed you a very simple way to elicit value at risk and conditional value at risk simply by looking at your screen, maybe using one line of Excel to divide by alpha. You do not need to rely on past observations, and that is theoretically very convenient in the case of expected shortfall, because you cannot really estimate well expected shortfall. I give you a hard number because it's based on the option price. It seems to have done a good job for the last 10 years. Of course, if there is a big behavioral bias, even that number may not be good. About the change in measure, we say that basically the change in measure is a function of the horizon you choose and the risk premium attached to the option. Of course, you can tell me that if the strike price of the option is very close to zero, the premium can be very large, but you will not be able to find a liquid option there, so you'll be missing the first requirement I required. So basically, we find that filter historical simulation provides extremely similar results. In the paper, there are also some pictures which show that the exceedances correspond. Of course, they tend to occur when they are the largest returns. We're talking of the same index in the same period. So basically, this is a very fast measure, which is going to be especially interesting during crashes and other times at which you do not really trust your statistical models. So basically, we're doing weekly and 3-day options in the next few months, and we hope to have more powerful tests. Anyway, these are very simple tests, so any of you who has access to option prices can duplicate them without doing much computing. Thank you.